As the war in Ukraine continues, we are hearing new warnings from Ukrainian officials believing that Russian attacks on New Year's Eve could significantly damage the energy system. Joining us now to talk more about the war is former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, William Taylor. William, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Natasha. Good to be here.
There are worries that Russia will launch more infrastructure attacks. Is there anything more that the U.S. and allies should be doing ahead of New Year's to help Ukraine right now?
Ahead of New Year's is going to be difficult. What we do need to be doing things to help the Ukrainians defend themselves against these attacks. And again, Natasha, as you've reported, these are attacks on unarmed civilians. These are attacks on energy. We've heard about, in this country, attacks on energy systems, and we've seen how devastating it can be. We've seen in Buffalo what happens when people are cut off. Well, Ukraine is cut off that way by the Russians. Ukraine is being cut off in the middle of a horrible winter by the Russians and these attacks. Now, what can we do? Yes, we should help the Ukrainians defend themselves against these attacks, and we should provide the weapons to enable the Ukrainians to go deep against the Russian military that are conducting these attacks. And we need to help the Ukrainians get through this winter. So this is in terms of humanitarian assistance, in terms of replacements for their electrical grids. There's a lot of things that we can be doing, and now's the time to do it.
And according to the UN, at least 6,800 Ukrainian civilians have been killed since Russia invaded the country in February. And there are also, of course, those allegations that Russia committed war crimes. Let's listen quickly to what the UN had to say about that.
In some cases, Russian soldiers executed civilians in makeshift places of detention. Others were summarily executed on the spot, following security checks in their houses, yards, and doorways, even where the victim had shown clearly that they were not a threat, for example, by holding their hands in the air. There are therefore strong indications that the summary executions documented in the report may constitute the war crime of willful killing.
How does one hold Russia accountable here?
Natasha, the way the international community, the world, is going to hold Russia accountable is to help the Ukrainians win. If the Ukrainians win, then they'll be able to take actions with the international community, but also their own justice system, to hold to account those Russians up and down the chain of command who have perpetrated these atrocities, these war crimes. So the Ukrainians have to win. We have to support them as they fight the Russians. And then we have to support the exercise of the justice system, both in Ukraine and then in the international community. There are courts that are set up and new courts that can be set up to take the actions that are going to hold the Russians accountable for these atrocities, for these war crimes, and probably for genocide.
Have some of the arms and the tools that have been given to Ukraine by the West, have they been altered or disabled so that Ukraine cannot actually attack Russia? It can only defend against attacks. Is that true? And is that a good continuing strategy? Or does Ukraine, must they be allowed to strike back against Russia?
Ukrainians are striking back against Russia using their own weapons. We've seen them strike deep into Russian territory to attack military targets. They've attacked military airfields where the bombers and the other aircraft are based that fire the missiles at the Ukrainian civilian infrastructure, at the energy systems that are being attacked. So the Ukrainians are attacking deep into Russia with their own weapons. The Ukrainians and the Americans have an agreement that the Ukrainians will not use U.S. weapons in Russia. They will use U.S. weapons in Ukraine against Russians who are on occupied territory, Russian-occupied territory. And yes, I think they should be able, I think the Ukrainians ought to be able to strike at Russian military targets. When those military targets are striking them, the Ukrainians ought to be able to strike back, no matter where they are, whether they're in Russia or whether they're in Russian-occupied Ukraine.
Thank you for watching. Go to newsnationnow.com to find NewsNation on your television provider. And don't forget to click the red subscribe button below to get more of NewsNation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.